Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parasha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamet in Highland Park, New Jersey at the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation Anshe Emet. Joining me, my good friends, Rabbi Jeremy Galmanovsky, Anshe Chesed, New York City, Rabbi Barry Chesler, Solomon Schechter Day School of Long Island, somewhere in Long Island. We are talking about Parasha Vayishlach 2021, and I want to say it's an amazing parsha. It is an amazing parsha because that's what we say here. But this is it's
And they all are.
and they all are. It's hard.
After we're done with them.
This is a difficult parsha. Lots of very, very complicated, difficult themes in this parsha. Let's talk. We'll enter into this theme of there's contact and contact sport and contact between two men or one man and one being. Okay. The first scene is really a scene of violence. Jacob has sent out messengers to his brother Esav. He's alone. I'm skipping a lot. And he meets this mysterious apparition. And is the Torah trying to take us somewhere with this scene? And I'm going to ask Jeremy to begin to reflect on this and to maybe we're going to stitch this idea here. It's an encounter. It's not a passive encounter. It's actually quite a violent encounter. What's going on there?
Yeah, quite so. Jacob is coming back after all these years away. He's got to confront something really extremely difficult. He's got to confront his brother, who, when he last saw him 20 odd years before, wanted to kill him for having stolen his economic advantage and his familial role, both his bechorah, his birthright, and his bracha, his familial role. And Jacob is left all alone, having placed his entire household, his four, two official and two junior wives, and all the children in two camps in some sort of defensive, but not totally defended position. Jacob is left alone on the other side of the river Yabok. Yaakov and Yabok sound so similarly that it's impossible not to feel like he's really wrestling. He's really confronting something deep in the self, perhaps his guilt about his own bad behavior, or he's got a struggle for his identity. But it says he's left all alone and someone wrestles with him. Now we can say that he's left all alone means that whoever he's wrestling with has to be himself in his aloneness. It might be an angel sent to challenge him, but they spend all night in hand-to-hand conflict. Neither can defeat the other until the morning. Jacob and the being, the Ish in biblical Hebrew can mean, one individual among the group. It can be like the stars. Each star is the Ish lo ne'edar. Not a single one is lost. Ish can be a human person. It can be human male. It can mean an angel being, an angelic being. And there's a strong, sense of violence in his need to confront this challenge, whether it's an external or internal challenge. It can't be met with reflection and thought or even words. There aren't really words. It's violence. By the way, this year I read, thanks to my bar mitzvah boy this week, Benji Solomon, let's hear it for Sefaria. The Rashbam on this verse says, who's the angel? God sends the angel to Yaakov because Yaakov, after having brought his spouses and his children across the river, made to run away. He went to run away. And the angel gets sent by God to keep him there, to force him to stand and fight. I thought this was just brilliant. I never heard that before.
Well, it does pick up on one of the emotional charges of the story, which is I don't want to encounter this. I don't want to confront this. And I know you meant this. Yaakov, Yabok, and Ye'avek.
And Ye'avek, the wrestling.
The wrestling.
Yeah, exactly.
Yaakov. These that gorgeous set of puns or plays on words.
It's interesting because the pun, it really works beautifully. Yabok is Yud Bet Kuf. Yaakov is with an I and a silent letter. And Ye'avek is with an aleph, another silent letter. It's as if they're linguistically, they seem to all three be the same thing.
Yeah.
So, okay.
I want to pick up on
Go ahead.
Something Jeremy said. When you were talking, Jeremy, about the familial, I kept hearing familiar.
Mhm.
And it wasn't until the last time that I finally actually heard what you said, but it led me to think that the family is what's familiar. And I imagine Jacob is coming back. He thinks he's changed, but he does not think Esau has changed. And that's why he's nervous.
Fascinating.
And what makes it so striking for me is that what we see in the description is clearly Esau has changed. Right? He comes, even though he has a large army, he's friendly, he's gracious. And Jacob seems very much the same Jacob as when he left.
Well, he's not the same. And here, just go back, rewind 5 seconds, because he gets it says Vateka kaf yerach Yaakov. He gets injured, and here back to the theme of violence. There is a moment of violence. It's I guess it's a low blow. It's a thigh blow. It's a Charlie horse.
No,
Well,
I think you had it right the first time. I think it's like Simna Yadcha Tachat Yerechi.
Okay,
I think
yeah,
it's
it's euphemistic.
I think it's the man zone basically there.
So again, so we have this battle. It's clear what Jacob is fighting for because he says at the very end, he wants a blessing. Well, what was the angel, or however you want to describe him, what was he fighting for? It? And that really is the answer that Rashbam provides, which was new to me, but actually makes a great deal of sense. And that would be why they're fighting.
which
To
is
force
why.
him to confront.
To force him to confront, right?
That he can't run away.
So
And
then,
yeah, the fact of the injury, we talked about this a little bit before we started recording. The sort of one has to be wounded to be whole, and he's Vayavo Yaakov Shalem. Ultimately, he's going to say Jacob shows up whole, but he's wounded, and if you're going to confront this in the fullest sense, it's not peaceful. Maybe it's inner struggle or inner strife, but it's not, zen and peaceful. It's agonizing. It's a fight.
so the meaning of the two, Vayishakehu, and that word is famously dotted in the Torah and gives rise to some lovely midrashim that seem to really
Well, they're
convey
violent,
the violence that Esav reaches in to bite him, to really try and kill him. But we are very conciliatory to Esav in our little Parsha tank here.
By the way, I went to go look.
Three hairy men.
In preparation for this, I went to go look at the passage in Breshit Rabbah about the biting.
Yes.
And there are two teachings there. Shimon ben Elazar says it's dotted to show how much Esav loved his brother, and the other guy said, and Rabbi Yanai comes along and says it's dotted to say he tried to bite him. The first one says Milamed shenichmeru rachamav be'ota sha'a unshako b'cholibo. The first one, Shimon ben Elazar says he just, his heart melted and he just kissed him with love. And Rabbi Yanai says he's trying to bite him.
Yeah, isn't that the truth, though?
That you can't tell the difference.
Well, that there's a little there's a little bit of violence there, a little bit. There may be a lot. There may be, that is it ever one way or the other? I guess there's the Torah wants us to see a little bit of ambiguity here, that this relationship may not be totally resolved, but I don't know.
What we should do? We should refer to this, the scene in Godfather Part 2.
Yes.
When Cuba is falling and Michael and Fredo are in New Year's Eve in Havana, and Michael kisses Fredo on the mouth and says to him, "I know it was you, Fredo, you broke my heart." And on one hand, it's the kiss of death, and he will ultimately kill Fredo, but he's also his brother, and it's because he broke his heart. It's because he loved him and broke his heart that the betrayal was so bad.
Yeah.
So maybe this is a little bit, maybe Esav's a little bit like Michael Corleone. I love you, and I'm so enraged and violent towards you.
I'm going to quote you in my Parsha sheet. Okay, all right. Let's go. So Yaakov comes after this event, and you quoted it before. Vayavo Yaakov Shalem, Ir Shechem. He comes to the city of Shechem in this whole state, and he's kind of broken, but he's whole. There's been this cathartic meeting with all the ambivalence and ambiguity that we can muster in interpreting this. And that's probably also what makes him whole. And then Jeremy, things just go off the rails. This is
Yeah.
the most difficult story in Breshit. Okay, I'm nominating that.
I'll
Or
go
one
with
of the
that
top
too.
three. Go ahead. So here, what goes on after this? Vatetze Dina bat Leah. Dina goes out among Asher Yalda Yaakov lirot bivnot haaretz, a totally ambiguous or crazy phrase, to see the women, the girls of the land. And a certain Shem ben Chamor takes a liking to her. He falls in love with her at first sight. And it's a little bit, it goes very, very crazy, violent. Vayishkav ota vayanea. He rapes her, basically, ravishes her. And if we then fast forward, what do the children of Israel do? And these are our ancestors. Jeremy Kalmanovsky.
Well, Barry, I had the first try. Barry,
You go ahead, Barry.
Well, I thank you for the great honor, Jeremy. You're always more eloquent in these matters than I am. So I think the brothers want to become diplomats. And, Shechem persuades his father, who I guess is an ass, that
Chamor.
Explain the joke. Yeah.
Chamor being the Hebrew word for donkey, that he loves Dina and he wants to marry her, and he has to do everything he can so that he could get her as a wife. And so they arrange a deal which seems on the surface to be reasonable. They want to enter into a pact, a brit, as it were, a covenant. And so the men of Shechem, which is also the area where Shechem ben Chamor lives, will agree to be circumcised so that they can become like the Israelites, the Bnei Israel. And then they will be able to take the women of Jacob's family as wives, and Jacob's sons and grandsons presumably will be able to take the local women as their wives.
Which is, but let me just put parentheses. It's a fascinating, it really is totally from the male masculine. V'hitchatnu otanu benotechem titnu lanu. We will marry. We will intermarry. Your daughters, you will give to us. Vet benotenu tikhu lachem, and our daughters will give to them. So there's no intermarriage of males. It's only females, right? There seems to be a whole cadre of women who are going to cross over the boundaries, right? And
It does seem like, yes, it does seem like what happens in an intermarriage is that the woman, unlike the fact that later Judaism will have Judaism and Jewish identity pass matrilineally,
right?
It does seem like the facts on the ground in a biblical story is that when a woman from clan A or ethnic identity A goes to marry a man of ethnic identity B, she becomes him. It's not the other way around.
And do you know what the most ironic thing is, or one of them is that in Breshit, when we have the union of a man and a woman, it says Al ken yazov ish et aviv et imo. A man will leave his father and mother and join with his wife and become one flesh. And so,
and yes, that's true. And furthermore, by the way, when Devarim was going to prohibit idol worship, it's worried that the Jew, the Israelite, will marry the non-Jewish, and he will be called to her family's sacrifice.
there you go.
So it's complicated here.
It's so complicated. So Barry, continue. And so they create.
So they agree. They think that they have a nice deal, Shechem and Chamor and company. And on the third day, which is the most painful day.
They circumcise them. You forgot to mention.
Oh, yes. On the third day after the circumcision, Shimon and Levi come in for a twisted kind of Bikur Cholim, visiting the sick, and kill all the males.
Okay.
And Jacob is quite put out. How could you do such a thing? It will ruin my reputation. And Shimon and Levi say, you can't treat our daughter like a whore.
Hachazona ya'aseh et achotenu. Is that how they're going to treat our daughter? Nivela asabi Israel. A terrible abomination was done in Israel.
So it would seem, on the surface at least, that Shimon and Levi defend the family honor, and Jacob is interested in hasbara, public relations. And it's a very disturbing story. There's no way to dress it up any other way, I think.
Well,
That's the
I
Torah's.
remember years when I studied at Pardes, Pardes, as our listeners know, or might know, is a kind of a liberal yeshiva, co-ed, and it's very Anglo, and in Jerusalem, and it has had a big effect on, I think, the Anglos of South Jerusalem for many years, since the 1980s. And I was there in the early 90s, and we were studying this story, and it was just really interesting because I think most of the Americans were horrified at the cruelty and deception. And some of yes, they were Anglo-Israelis, but they were Israelis who obviously have a different set of experiences, resonated much more to the claim of Shimon and Levi that there are certain things that you can't let stand. There are certain kinds of abuse for which you need to take vengeance. And, I do find it's partly like how you deal with all this Torah's stories about the cleverness and deception, how the clever Israelites trick somebody into an ambush or an attack or whatever. So this maybe is the story of the clever Levi and Shimon who don't let an abuse stand. They have to teach somebody a lesson, otherwise it's going to happen all the time.
So this is a kind of a war story for a bad neighborhood. And I think one of the things that separates the Anglo-Americans from the Anglo-Israelis is that the Israelis all go into the military service. And they do not live in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Most of us in America, anti-Semitism notwithstanding, this is Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. And we can't really imagine, most of us, for most of our lives, how violence could ever be a solution to a problem that we have.
And we would like religion to align with the point you just made. I think that we would like, shalom is so deeply layered into a Jewish value, not just for us Americans, but certainly for us Americans. We would like religion to say, this is a God is a God of love. This is a religion of peace. At the worst, you say, violence is the last resort. I think a story like this, complicated as it is, because both Jacob gets to say, you are destroying not just our reputation, but our ability to have good relationships with our neighbors. It gives Jacob that voice, and it gives Shimon and Levi the voice of saying, don't be a sucker. You're going to get your ass, you're going to get your butt whipped if you don't fight back. So the Torah, it gives us both of these perspectives.
On the one hand, I think the Torah wants us to feel a certain set, the pathos, that Jacob's response is somewhat pathetic and impotent, and that even his diplomacy his attempt at diplomacy is going to be a failure.
So here, I think we come back to the comment that Jeremy made about Jacob's injury.
Yeah.
It's a kind of injury of impotence. And in the very next story, then, he demonstrates how injured he actually is.
Indeed.
The other piece of it that I think we've touched on at various times throughout these shows is it also illustrates how little parents can protect their children.
It's so interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
There's an element of luck that we often do not take into account. But bad things can happen to our children, and we have to find a way to deal with that, both for our children and for ourselves. And God knows it's not easy.
That brings to mind another theme in the modern discourse over this story, which is it's totally not focused on the victim at all. Dinah, is really a very passive figure in this whole story.
I would say she's it's a marginal figure, not, and I'm not saying that we should think of her as marginal, but I think that the Torah does think that, okay, something happened to her, doesn't give us a ton of detail about it, but it certainly does not, and as most modern, certainly, women readers of this story will say, well, what is she thinking? because Shechem's behavior is described somewhat ambiguously. First of all, he sleeps with her and Vaya'aneha, humbles her, seemingly like a rape. And then it says, Vayidaber el lev hana'ara, he speaks to her heart. Vayidaber al lev hana'ara. And that is a phrase, like Dabru al lev Yerushalayim is what Isaiah does to comfort the broken Jerusalem, speak to the heart of Jerusalem. Vayidaber al lev hana'ara, he speaks to her heart. That's a phrase which, in most contexts in the Hebrew Bible, seems like a nice thing.
Right.
So,
But I think, Jeremy, if I might interject, we would expect the preposition to be al, not al. Al also means about. That it's an expression of indirectness as well as directness that I think we have to reckon with.
okay, that's totally possible. It's totally possible. But what I think is, and so that would go in a different direction than what I just said, but it is totally possible in this story that, well, it's certainly true that we do not know what her reaction is. It might be thoroughly traumatized and negative. It might be reconciled. We don't know.
We don't know.
Oh, here I think it's important to add, we were talking before how this is a story where people could say things that they might later regret. And I think that Dinah is not the focus of the story. The story that you're describing is imagining Dinah as a victim is an important story, but it's not the Torah story. Dinah is a kind of a catalyst. She's like Isaac at the Akedah, and she's like Job's family that gets destroyed, for a silly wager between God and Satan. That they're necessary for the drama of the story to unfold, but we're not supposed to think about them as real people because that's too painful.
No, but obviously she is, and the Torah is focusing us away from her realness to the other realness that's going on here, which is the big, the political problem that they will have in living together and defining themselves as a nation in the land, given God's promise and given the covenant that exists with them, and that's just not even going to be a starter. It's a non-starter with them, which is, but the violence that they perpetrate, the massacre of Shechem, has to linger on somehow, as the thesis is that all violent acts do linger on somewhere in the violent perpetrator and in the locale.
So we know they're living in a land of seven nations, and what will become a land of seven nations. And you read a story like this and taking it on a political level, how would you ever trust these people again if you lived there? And the response of the Torah is to annihilate the citizens of the land, right? The Torah doesn't say make peace with the Girgashim and the Chivim, etc. It says wipe them out. And I think in a sort of perhaps twisted way, it provides a justification for the military policy of the nation of Judah and Israel to destroy the inhabitants so that they can make peace in their own land.
But they never succeeded in accomplishing this. The war with the Canaanites persists throughout biblical history, and I mean here it's way beyond the scope of our talk here. But it's to what extent do they succeed in annihilating all of them, and to what extent does even the attempt linger on, and to what extent, of course, does our rabbinic tradition try to correct the violent impulses here? I think we are repulsed by this story. We on the other hand, we're also repulsed by the fact that this could happen, and that an innocent woman is so treated by these people, and we don't want to have anything to do with them. That's I don't know if we can ever reconcile this. That's why we're left in this. For the sake of going on, for the rest of the parsha, it doesn't get better for Jacob.
Can I throw in the
Go ahead.
Can I throw in the thing we talked about before we started recording? We talked about before we started recording at the very end of the book of Genesis, Jacob on his deathbed gives a blessing to the tribes, some of which is quite critical, especially to Shimon and Levi. and in which Jacob takes a dig at their cruelty in this episode. And, in the main and rabbinic, in biblical tradition, neither of those tribes has a real land stake. Shimon evidently is
Beitzah.
like they don't really get their own land. They're put into Judah. Levi they don't get the land. They are national servants. They're religious national servants. And I was reminded of a rule in Judaism that the priestly blessing cannot be said or should not be said by somebody who has ever killed another person. The Talmud says that if your hands, that the gesture of prayer is lifting your hands and giving the Birkat HaKohanim, the priestly blessing, is called Nisiat Kapayim, lifting the hands. And if you have blood on your hands, you can't lift your hands in prayer. I was in the course of our talk, I just called up here on my computer the paragraph in the Shulchan Aruch about this fact. Elliot said, does it leave an effect does a homicide leave an effect on the person? Does violence leave an effect on the perpetrator? The tribe of Levi is supposed to be an instrument of peace, but they have been an instrument of this very cruel violence. So here's the rule, as it appears in the Shulchan Aruch, quoted from the Talmud: Kohen sheharag et hanefesh, afilu b'shogeg lo yisad kapav, afilu asat tshuva. A Kohen who killed some other person, even by accident, should not recite Birkat Kohanim, even if they made tshuva. That's the Shulchan Aruch's rule, in the words of Yosef Caro, who, as our listeners probably know, was a Spanish Jew living in the land of Israel. Exile from Spain in 1492, living in the Eastern Mediterranean and then Israel. Rav Moshe Isserles, the Polish rabbi who is the sort of second co-author of the Shulchan Aruch, adds, he dissents a little bit and says, well, if a person has done shuvah, they can recite Birkat HaKohanim, and we should do that to encourage penitence. And that's the way we practice here in Ashkenaz. So I think that's pretty interesting. You have the one Sephardic tradition that's really quite strict. Death, causing death, homicide, violence, and a blessing of peace, incompatible. You can't do it. And the Ashkenazi authority says, we got to try to open the door and bring people back in.
I want to add something else here, that Shechem, there is a lingering effect of the story, but it's not in our Parsha. And, one of the things that I think I've mentioned before, maybe mostly to myself, I guess, is that we do ourselves something of a disservice sometimes because we tend to read the Torah in a very localized fashion. We go parsha to parsha, a few chapters, say, each week, and so we often forget what comes next and where we've been. But in next week in Vayeshev, the brothers are going to be pasturing in Shechem, and that's where Joseph is going to go at first. So they have taken over the place that they destroyed, in a sense, because that's their pasture land now. And it's going to set into motion the violence of the Joseph story, which we can dress it up any way you want. And, the Pharaoh, of course, in any case will dress up Joseph, but it's a very violent story as well.
Also, they want to kill him. All right. Speaking of sad outcomes, for Jacob, this story is very sad. He does get a blessing. He does get his name, a new name, Yisrael, in a rather elaborate vision or appearance of God. And then we understand and read that first the Dvorah Meneket Rivka, there's one death that occurs, the nurse of Rebecca, which is the closest link that Jacob has to his mother. She dies. And then we learn that as they're making their way to Hebron, Rachel dies. And she dies in childbirth. It says, Vayisumi Betel, Vayihi od kivrat haaretz lavo Ephrata. They're making their way to Ephrata, on the way to Hebron. Vateled Rachel vatikash belidata. She goes into birth, and she has terrible difficulty in birth. As she is dying, the midwife says, don't worry, you have given birth to a son, and as she lets out the last breath, basically, she calls him Ben Oni, which could be understood as either son of my strength, my last strength, or son of my anguish. And Yaakov calls him Binyamin. She is buried there, and that is Kever Rachel up until this day. And the Torah is silent here with Jacob after her death. And I don't know if you want to give some reflection to that, or just think about where the arc of this life, and how this moment of tragic bereavement will affect his life and the life of the family going on. And I don't know, Jeremy, maybe you see more of this in the pastoral life of the rabbi, and how tragedy unfolds in a family, and how all the unstated things that are here underneath the verse, they're there. They're impenetrable. But they're gonna. I mean, we're teeing up next week. You're gonna see the echoes of this, don't you think?
No, totally. As you said, we're teeing up next week. We are teeing up the fact that, I mean, I did the wrestling story with some teens yesterday, and it was interesting to me. These are wonderful teens, some of whom went to, not all of them, some of them went to Jewish day school through like elementary or middle school, others did not, and they're still going kids, and they just asked me a bunch of questions, like narrative questions, shot questions about the story. And it was interesting to me what they knew correctly, what they didn't know correctly. And one kid said, well, Jacob has two favorite sons, right? And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, there's both Joseph and Benjamin. How come? And they didn't sort of know that it was because Rachel is the mother of the two favorite sons. So we're teeing up the fact that, and what does she say when Joseph is finally born? First of all, Asaf et cherpati, it's Joseph because the shame rolled away, but then Yosef li ben acher, God will give me another child. So we got Joseph and Benjamin as the beloved of Jacob because they are Rachel's children. But of course, a parent is going to feel, a combination of a great deal of ambivalence towards Benjamin. He is partly, I mean, not through his own decision, of course, or whatever, but he's associated with or responsible for the death of his mother.
No, the Jacob is responsible for the death of the mother.
Well, because you're talking about the curse from last week.
Well, not only that, but it's like, she was my wife. I actually got her in this state. It's my fault. I read Jacob here as it's unresolved, the guilt that
if that's the case, Elliot, I think you would have had a stronger case, I think, for Jacob than leaving the name. But he renames Binyamin, and Binyamin becomes Jacob's right hand, as it were. And I'm reminded of the scene after Stonewall Jackson was killed by his own troops and lingered for a while before he died. And Lee said he lost his right hand. And the pathos in 2 weeks, when we get to Miketz, of Joseph, of Jacob first losing Joseph and then thinking he's going to lose his right hand, is practically devastating. So with the death of Rachel, it altered, the sons become much more important because they're all he has left of his beloved wife.
And I'm not, I don't want to disagree with you. I think that another way to interpret it is that Benjamin, of course, represents all the guilt that Jacob has, and Yamin, has lots of layers of meaning to it. It's also south, and it's the son of the south, and by giving him that kind of name, which could be a geographical name, and it neuters the pathos of the moment of his death. I don't think that he is trying to remove the anguish that he has to carry with himself the rest of his life by giving him something that's not related to the actual death. It's
a nice interpretation too.
Maybe
conflict. I mean, perhaps back to the original wrestling story. Perhaps we're inclined to think that with the most important problems of our lives, we are heady folks. We're American Jews are, typically hyper educated and heady and verbal, and we might think that we can talk our way, reason our way, psychotherapeutically reflect our way to our problems and deal with them. And all that is, of course, partly true. And conflict, deep conflict, painful, sometimes injuring, sometimes involving like actual physical violence, or in the final story of the narrative of this parasha, when Reuven attempts to assert his own power by sleeping with Jacob's wife, itself a kind of sexual violence. And we don't know what Dinah's reaction is, we don't know what Bilhah's reaction is. We're not told that Bilhah always thought Reuven was kind of cute, or that Reuven, unleashed actual physical violence against her. We don't know any of those things, but that's also a kind of assault. And there's just real conflict. It's not going away.
Okay, so we got to end our conversation, and I'm trying to find like a little bit of comfort here.
The Kings of Edom.
Okay,
Isn't that the last chapter?
Before we get to the Kings of Edom, we got Yitzchak's death, okay, which is sad, but this is the moment. This is the moment where Yaakov comes. Yaakov, vayavo Yaakov el Yitzchak aviv. So there is a kind of foreshadowing of a re-encounter of father and son. After many, many years of estrangement, they're together at Kiryat Arba. And then the very next pasuk in verse 35-25, Vayu yimei Yitzchak me'at shana u'shmonim shana. He's 180 years old. Vayigva, vayamot, vayasef el amav, vayikberu oto Esav v'Yaakov banav. And so there is a kind of moment in the death of Yitzchak which brings together these two strands of the family, the Jacobs and the Esav, and their patriarch has gone, and that, like the death of Abraham, where Yishmael and Yitzchak are together, indicates to us that there's possibility of reconciliation here. I think is that would you put that thumbs up, double thumbs up on that?
I like it. I think that that's absolutely true. I mean, with Yishmael and Yitzchak, one of them won and one of them lost. One of them, was centered and one of them was marginalized. And similarly here too. But Esav seems to, like Barry said at the beginning of our conversation, which I think is exactly right. Jacob comes back thinking that Esav hasn't changed in 20 years, but he has.
Yeah.
So the other thing to note here is that Abraham is buried by his two most prominent sons.
Yes.
Isaac is buried by all of his sons. And Jacob will be buried by all of his sons who are in the covenant. And so there's a progression of tightening of the family bond as we move through the generations.
Beautiful. A fascinating note by which we conclude our Parsha Talk. We want to thank you all for watching and listening to us. We're looking forward to more great Parsha conversations. In the meantime, for my buddies, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanowski, Rabbi Barry Chesler, Shalom and Shabbat
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.